Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a fascinating journey, really into the profound and often mysterious landscape of the human psyche. You sent us a stack of sources, articles, research, your notes, all centered on C.G. Jung's monumental The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. That's his Volume 9I from the Collected Works, first published back in 1957. Our mission today is really to cut through the density and, unpack Jung's core concepts. We're aiming for those genuine aha moments, whether you're grappling with this for psychology, literature, or philosophy. It's truly a deep dive into the hidden currents that, well, shape us.
Indeed. And we'll explore what Jung actually meant by the collective unconscious, delve into the nature and symbolic roles of key archetypes like the shadow, the animus, the great mother, wise old man, hero, and the self. We'll also examine how these universal patterns show up in myths, dreams, and our own psychological lives, and then maybe offer some critical perspectives that Jung himself held about his ideas.
Okay, sounds good. Let's unpack this and dive deep into the mind of Jung. The deep well. Unpacking the collective unconscious.
Right, so this deep dive draws heavily from Jung's exploration into a fundamental, um, impersonal layer of the psyche, which he meticulously differentiates from what he called the personal unconscious.
That's a really crucial distinction, isn't it? So if the personal unconscious is where we store like all our forgotten memories and repressed experiences, then how did Jung see this deeper, more fundamental collective layer working? He describes it as sheer objectivity, as wide as the world and open to all the world. What did he mean by something so incredibly expansive?
Well, he meant it quite literally, I think. The core idea is that the collective unconscious is not something we acquire through personal experience. It's inherited. Jung suggests this concept is no more daring than to assume there are instincts.
Okay.
Just as our physical activities are influenced by inborn instincts,
Oh.
like a bird knowing how to build a nest without being taught, he argues that our imagination, our perception, and our thinking are similarly shaped by these inborn and universally present formal elements.
So he's not saying this is some mystical, speculative idea, but something we can actually observe and
Yeah.
study, making it an empirical matter. That's a bold claim, especially given the mystical reputation Jung sometimes gets. How did he actually demonstrate the existence of these unconscious universal forms in his work?
He certainly brought forth some compelling examples. One of the most famous is the case of a paranoid schizophrenic patient he treated. Around 1906, this patient described a vision of the sun's penis moving and creating wind.
Right.
Years later, in 1910, Jung came across this exact imagery in a newly published Greek papyrus. It was detailing a Mithraic ritual. And
Wow.
what makes this so powerful, Jung argued, is that the patient, having been institutionalized for years, couldn't possibly have known about that papyrus.
That's astonishing. It really points to something beyond, well, beyond mere coincidence, something that feels like a common deep-seated image. Didn't he also note medieval paintings of the Annunciation, where the Holy Ghost or the Christ child descends as this, like, fructifying wind through a tube from God's throne?
Exactly. He argued these aren't just subjective chimeras, as he put it.
Right.
They're normal types of fantasy that occur practically everywhere.
Okay.
And the profound implication here is that these aren't just random individual thoughts. They are universal patterns of fantasy. They emerge spontaneously across different cultures, different times, without direct learning. He also applies this to our earliest developmental stages. He argues that the preconscious psyche of a newborn infant isn't an empty vessel.
No blank slate, then.
Not at all. He saw it as a tremendously complicated, sharply defined individual entity with an a priori structure of its own that antedates all conscious experience. This, he argues, points to inherited patterns, much like hereditary predispositions or, animal instincts.
When you hear about this idea, this inherited pre-existing psychic framework, it really makes you think, doesn't it? How might Jung's concept of the collective unconscious challenge, say, purely behaviorist or environmentalist views of human development? Those views often emphasize external conditioning as the main shaper of who we are.
Well, it fundamentally suggests we come into the world with a kind of universal blueprint, something that shapes how we perceive and react to our environment, rather than us just being a blank slate written on by experience. Now, this doesn't negate environmental influences, of course, but it adds this innate inherited dimension. It suggests certain responses or symbolisms are deeply wired in us, regardless of specific learning experiences.
And looking at our modern world, what kinds of phenomena, maybe popular culture tropes, or even collective anxieties, might suggest the influence of a collective unconscious today? From a Jungian perspective, I mean, what stands out to you?
Oh, that's a great question. Um, Maybe the global appeal of superhero narratives, or stories of chosen ones overcoming immense odds.
Yeah, okay.
You could see those as modern expressions of the hero archetype's journey, or even the death rebirth motif that seems to pop up everywhere, transcending specific cultures. Similarly, widespread fascinations with certain dystopian or utopian visions might tap into deeper inherited patterns of hope or fear for humanity's future.
That's a really compelling way to think about it. And for those of you listening, maybe as you reflect on this, consider trying a simple exercise this week. Keep a dream journal, but specifically look for any recurring symbols or figures that feel, I don't know, bigger than your personal experience. Do any resonate with ancient myths? And if you want to explore more about Jung's early thoughts on these parallels, he delves into them in his earlier work, Symbols of Transformation. 2. The universal cast. Archetypes as psychic forms.
Right, so Jung's work then moves from the vastness of the collective unconscious to define its specific manifestations, the archetypes themselves. He meticulously details their symbolic roles, drawing from really rich historical, mythological, and clinical material.
So, if the collective unconscious is the deep well, archetypes are the specific, recurring forms that bubble up from it. Jung says they're not fixed in content, but in form, like the axial system of a crystal, which, as it were, performs the crystalline structure in the mother liquid. They're empty and purely formal, a possibility of representation which is given a priori. Such a precise analogy for something so elusive. What's the big insight there for us?
Well, the powerful insight here is that beneath the, infinite variety of human stories and cultures, there's a universal pre-existing software for our psyche. We're sort of wired to recognize and react to patterns like the hero's journey or the shadow, not necessarily because we learned them, but because they're part of our innate psychological architecture.
Ah, okay.
It's why myths from all over the globe resonate with us so deeply. He also calls them ambiguous, full of half-glimpsed meanings, and in a last resort, inexhaustible, which emphasizes their dynamic living nature in our lives.
Let's start with one of the most well-known, the shadow. Jung famously says, the meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow. He described the shadow as personifying everything that the subject refuses to acknowledge about himself, and yet is always thrusting itself upon him directly or indirectly, like inferior traits or incompatible tendencies.
Exactly. And he considers encountering the shadow the apprentice piece in an individual's development.
The first step.
The first and often hardest step. It's a tight passage, a narrow door. That, he argues, no one is spared from if they want to mature psychologically.
Yeah.
And the significant implication is that integrating the shadow, really owning it, brings about an alteration of personality. It leads to a more complete, more authentic sense of self, even if it means facing uncomfortable truths.
Then there's the anima and animus. For those who might not be familiar, the anima is the feminine principle in a man's unconscious, and the animus is the masculine principle in a woman's unconscious.
That's right.
And how does Jung describe the encounter with these inner opposites? Well, he calls the encounter with the anima the masterpiece in development, an ordeal by fire.
An ordeal by fire, yes. And this often involves confronting projections initially seen outside, maybe onto a dominating mother figure or onto partners or members of the opposite sex in general. The anima is described as bipolar, meaning it can appear positive one moment and negative the next. Now young, now old, now mother, now maiden, now a good fairy, now a witch, now a saint, now a whore. It's multifaceted. It often has these occult connections with mysteries, with the world of darkness, which is why she often has a kind of religious tinge. And she's often immortal because outside time.
And what's the deeper significance when we genuinely engage with this archetype?
When seriously engaged with, the anima reveals a deeper meaning. It shows a hidden purpose which seems to reflect a superior knowledge of life's laws. She acts as a psychopomp. That's Jung's term for a guide of souls, a spiritual guide, who points the way to the highest meaning. It's really about integrating one's other side, leading to greater psychological balance and creativity.
Moving on to the Great Mother. This archetype forms the foundation of what Jung called the mother complex. It's the glorified image of mother love, a mysterious root of all growth and change. It represents homecoming, shelter, and the long silence from which everything begins and in which everything ends. Very primal.
Absolutely, and she embodies a profound duality, lovingly tender and yet cruel like fate, joyous and untiring giver of life mater dolorosa, and mute implacable portal that closes upon the dead.
So, both nurturing and terrifying.
Precisely. She is the inborn image of the mater natura and mater spiritualis, of the totality of life. Jung notes her connection to the earth, darkness, the abysmal side of the bodily man with his animal passions. He even points out that sometimes, due to what he called modern feminine unconscious prejudice, she can appear in unaesthetic forms, representing the darker, devouring aspects.
And the psychological impact here is key, isn't it? A mother complex isn't resolved by simply blaming or, analyzing the personal mother.
Exactly. It's about understanding her as the accidental carrier of that great experience, the archetype itself. He even uses dogmatic symbols like the Virgin Mary in the Church as a way culture tries to, quote, formulate a tremendous and dangerously decisive psychic experience in a tolerable form. He mentions Brother Nicholas of Flu's Trinity Vision as an example of transforming a terrible original experience into a comprehensible symbol.
Right, containing these powerful, even overwhelming psychological realities.
Then we have the wise old man. This archetype pierces the chaotic darknesses of brute life with the light of meaning. He is the enlightener, the master and teacher, a psychopomp. Jung also calls him the archetype of meaning.
And he can appear in many forms too, a wise magician like Nietzsche's Zarathustra, or figures like Hermes Trismegistus or Thoth. Interestingly, you mentioned he can be tiny, like a dwarf or a little Iron Man, or even appear as the Lord God himself. That really highlights the sheer flexibility of these archetypes.
It does. And like all archetypes, he has both a positive and a negative aspect. He can be one-sided or handicapped, like losing an eye, reminiscent of mythological figures like Wotan or Osiris. In some tales, he's a life-bringer as well as a death dealer. It captures the ambiguity of wisdom and power.
Then we have the child archetype. This motif represents not only something that existed in the distant past, but also something that exists now. It's a system functioning in the present whose purpose is to compensate or correct the inevitable one-sidednesses and extravagances of the conscious mind. So it's not just about childhood nostalgia, but a continuous potential within us.
Precisely. Its role in individuation is crucial. It is a symbol which unites the opposites. A mediator, bringer of healing, that is, one who makes whole. It embodies potential future, anticipating new personality developments. It appears widely in folklore, dwarfs, elves, Tom Thumb in psychopathology as imaginary children, and very notably in the maturation process of personality induced by the analysis of the unconscious, which Jung calls the individuation process. Its symbolic representations often include roundness circles, spheres, or the quaternity. Jung notes its size and invincibility are bound up with the concept of the Atman, smaller than small, yet bigger than big.
And the hero archetype is closely related then, often embodying this child archetype's journey into maturity.
Yes, very much so. The hero is human but raised to the limit of the supernatural. He is semi-divine. He represents a synthesis of the divine, i.e. not yet humanized, unconscious and human consciousness.
So the hero isn't just about physical strength, but about psychological evolution, integration.
Exactly. The hero signifies the potential anticipation of an individuation process which is approaching wholeness. His miraculous birth and adversities of early childhood abandonment and danger through persecution, these illustrate the precariousness and immense difficulties in attaining this wholeness, this highest good. The threat from dragons and serpents symbolizes the ever-present danger of newly acquired consciousness being swallowed up again by the instinctive psyche, the unconscious.
Like regression.
Right. Jung uses the myth of Heracles, his 12 labors, his journeys, submission to the feminine, self-sacrifice, rebirth, as a classic example of an individuation process.
Okay, finally, we arrive at the self. Jung defines this as the subordinate personality distinct from the ego. The self comprises the totality of the psyche altogether, i.e. conscious and unconscious, and the ego relates to the self as part to whole. That's a profound distinction. The ego we identify with is just a small piece of a much larger psychological whole.
And that's the key takeaway. The self is your true center, the organizing principle of your entire psyche, uniting both conscious and unconscious aspects. Empirically, the self is often felt not as subject but as object because its unconscious component often appears through projection onto others or symbols. It can be expressed through human figures, father-son, mother-daughter, king-queen, god-goddess, or abstract symbols like the circle, sphere, square, or mandalas. As psychic totality, the self is also a god image, since its central symbols point, circle, quaternity, are well-known symbols for the deity. He even quotes that famous line, God is an infinite circle or sphere whose center is everywhere and the circumference nowhere. Jung explores the self further in The Secret of the Golden Flower.
That's quite a universal cast of characters. Thinking about all these archetypes, how do they offer a framework for understanding universal human experiences despite, the vast cultural differences across the globe?
Well, they suggest that while the specific cultural narratives and individual experiences vary enormously, the underlying patterns of human experience, birth, death, struggle, finding wisdom, integration, are universal. The archetypes provide a kind of common language for these core experiences, a sort of deep grammar of the psyche that manifests uniquely in each culture, yet remains recognizably consistent underneath.
And for those of you who enjoy engaging with stories, maybe consider this. Pick a modern fictional character you know well. Which archetypes do they seem to embody? And how does this affect their narrative journey? Think about popular characters from books or films. How might their struggles or triumphs reflect these ancient patterns?
Yeah, and for those looking for a creative exercise, maybe try writing a short story or creating a character that exemplifies the bipolar nature of the anima or animus, showing both their positive and negative sides. Or for the child self, try creating a mandala reflecting your current understanding of wholeness. Use colors and shapes that resonate with your inner experience. Jung's own 1916 mandala of a modern man and his patient Miss X's dream mandala series, which you can actually see illustrations of in the book, are excellent inspirations. Jung also details mandalas and the alchemical process in his work, Psychology and Alchemy, if you want to dive deeper there. 3. The dynamic process, individuation and transformation. So building on these archetypes, this next section explains how they aren't just static concepts, but are deeply involved in dynamic processes of psychic development, particularly what Jung termed individuation.
Individuation. As Jung defines it, it's a synthetic process where the unconscious is integrated into consciousness. It's about a life in which the individual becomes what he always was. He describes it as a dialectical procedure, a real coming to terms with them archetypes, maybe sometimes like an inner colloquy with one's good angel. So it's not about becoming someone else, but truly realizing your innate potential.
That's precisely it. And this profound process often involves what Jung calls rebirth. He really stresses that rebirth is a purely psychic reality, not something tangible in the physical world, but maybe the most tremendous fact of human life. He even calls it the mother of all human facts, of civilization and of its destroyer, war, which really underscores its fundamental importance in human experience.
He identifies several forms of rebirth, which is fascinating. First, there are experiences induced by ritual, where participating in sacred rites like the Eleusinian mysteries or the Mass reveals this perpetual continuation of life through transformation and renewal.
Right. Then there are immediate experiences, those spontaneous, ecstatic, or visionary moments that happen without ritual, like Nietzsche's noontide vision, a profound personal awakening that transforms someone's perception of reality.
There's also subjective transformation, which can be an enlargement or a diminution of personality. When a summit of life is reached, he says, one becomes two, and a greater figure, what one always was but maybe remained hidden, appears, like St. Paul's encounter with Christ. Conversely, a diminution of personality is a significant loss of soul, a loss of that sense of self.
Then there's a fascinating, though maybe lower-level form, identification with a group. Jung calls this a simple and easy path to transformation, but notes it takes place on a lower level of consciousness, almost akin to mob psychology.
Sure.
And he warns that the change does not last unless it's constantly reinforced by mass intoxication. This is a really critical insight, distinguishing true individual transformation from temporary collective shifts.
That's a very relevant point, even today. And finally, technical transformation, induced by specific practices like Eastern yoga or Western exercitia spiritualia, like Ignatius Loyola's methods.
Yes, these are technical procedures designed to promote specific psychic effects, offering a structured path towards inner change. Jung illustrates transformation beautifully through the Islamic Khidr legend from the 18th surah of the Quran, the cave. The cave itself is depicted as a place of rebirth, a secret cavity in which one is shut up in order to be incubated and renewed. The middle of the cave is the center where transformation takes place, a really crucial symbolic element.
In this legend, Moses' quest with his shadow, Joshua, and his encounter with Khidr, the Verdant One, this is presented as a symbolic journey of individuation.
Exactly. Khidr, born in darkness, is the long-lived one and symbolizes the higher wisdom, a way of acting which is in accord with this wisdom and transcends reason. It's about a kind of wisdom that goes beyond conventional logic.
I see.
And the journey of Dulkarnain, from the sun setting to its rising, symbolizes the way of the renewal of the sun through death and darkness to a new resurrection. Jung concludes that the entire surah offers an almost perfect picture of a psychic transformation or rebirth, which today we would recognize as an individuation process. It really highlights how ancient myths can mirror these deep psychological processes.
And speaking of transformation, Jung frequently uses mandala symbolism to illustrate this, doesn't he? He analyzes personal mandalas, like those painted by his patient Miss X, to depict the individuation process. You mentioned the progression shows a journey of the self, from initial eggs as germs of life, through phases of division, like the quaternity representing the four functions of consciousness: thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition.
Yes, and then it progresses to the integration of opposites, where blackness is assimilated by the center, compensated by golden light, and ultimately towards the attainment of psychic totality, wholeness. He compares these personal creations to ancient symbols like Brahma's mandalas or the Chinese concept of yang and yin. He even notes the self can appear as a world-encircling band, often a snake, representing Mercurius. These images provide a kind of visual language for inner psychological development.
Considering these various forms of rebirth, how might group experiences, things like mass movements or even social media trends, facilitate a kind of superficial transformation that actually hinders deeper individual psychological growth?
That's a really interesting point. Group experiences, while powerful for building collective identity or creating change, can sometimes bypass the difficult internal work of confronting one's own shadow and integrating it. The temporary high of conformity or collective emotion can sometimes prevent the individual from wrestling with their unique inner conflicts. It might lead to a kind of psychic dependency rather than genuine self-realization. It's a very different kind of rebirth from the individual inner journey Jung focuses on.
That makes a lot of sense. And how might the concept of active imagination, a method Jung devised, be a useful tool for personal insight, even if you're not in therapy? What are its potential, maybe, challenges?
Well, active imagination involves focusing on a puzzling dream image or a spontaneous inner visual impression and observing its changes without judgment, suspending all criticism. For personal insight, it can directly connect you with the unconscious's symbolic language, potentially providing new perspectives on inner conflicts or feelings. The challenge lies precisely in that suspension of judgment. The ego can resist, fearing the content is just arbitrary or thought up. Or sometimes people can feel overwhelmed by the unconscious material that comes up. It requires courage to let the inner images unfold autonomously, just as Jung suggests.
For a creative prompt, you might try a short, active imagination exercise yourself. Focus on a puzzling dream image or a spontaneous inner visual impression. Observe its changes without judging and just note them down. Or maybe analyze a mythological hero's journey: Odysseus, Harry Potter, whoever resonates through the lens of the individuation process. Note how they overcome challenges by integrating previously unconscious aspects of themselves. 4. Jung's commentary, addressing misunderstandings and nuances.
Now, Jung often takes time in his writings to address common criticisms and provides his own critical perspective on other theories or, prevailing understandings. He's always clarifying the empirical basis and the deeper implications of his concepts.
One of the most common criticisms leveled at Jung is that his work is too mystical, maybe unscientific. How does he respond to what he calls the reproach of mysticism?
He definitely acknowledges the accusation, but he firmly reemphasizes that the collective unconscious is an empirical matter. It's grounded for him in observable psychological phenomena, not pure speculation. The question for Jung was simply whether these unconscious universal forms exist. And his clinical observations, plus his extensive study of world myths, convinced him that they do. They consistently appear, regardless of conscious knowledge or cultural background.
He also offers a pretty strong critique of reductive interpretations, doesn't he? Notably, Freud's analysis of Leonardo da Vinci's St. Anne with the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. Freud attributed the painting to Leonardo having two mothers, but Jung calls this a personalistic interpretation that overlooks an impersonal motif well known to us from other sources. He even suggests it's an instance of religious inhibition of thought on Freud's part.
Exactly. Jung argues forcefully against reducing rich symbolic meanings to nothing but primitive phantasms or personal biography. He saw this as a distortion that misses the profound universal patterns at play. It essentially strips away the deeper significance of archetypal images by reducing them solely to personal history or pathology.
What's really intriguing is Jung's take on the autonomy of the unconscious in normality. He states that the normal person convinces me far more of the autonomy of the unconscious than does the insane person. What does he mean by that?
He means that even in psychologically healthy individuals, things often appear from nowhere. A sudden idea, a surprising emotional reaction, an inexplicable insight, a slip of the tongue.
Mm-hmm.
Consciousness, being relatively new in human evolution, tends to make light of the unconscious or ignore its power. Normally, the unconscious collaborates with the conscious without friction or disturbance. But Jung observed that when an individual or a social group deviates too far from their instinctual foundations, they then experience the full impact of unconscious forces, often in disruptive, unexpected ways.
He also delves into the trickster figure, which he presents as a psychologum, an archetypal psychic structure of extreme antiquity, a reflection of absolutely undifferentiated human consciousness. Sounds like a pretty primal, chaotic force.
It is, very much so.
Yeah.
He argues that the myth of the trickster hasn't vanished because it continues to receive energy from a higher level of consciousness or from sources in the unconscious which are not yet exhausted. Its crucial function, he suggests, is to keep the shadow figure conscious and subjecting it to conscious criticism. It acts as a necessary, often uncomfortable, counterpoint to our ordered, civilized world.
Right.
He highlights its persistence in picaresque tales, in carnivals and revels, and even in modern expressions like hoodoos and jinxes, or maybe certain kinds of humor.
And he cites historical examples like the medieval Festum Stultorum, the Fool's Feast, and the Festum Asinorum, the Ass Festival. These were religious rituals that actually allowed for seemingly grotesque scurrility, rooted in these ancient archetypal expressions.
Yes, reflecting a kind of paradoxical attitude to myth that embraces both the sacred and the profane, the orderly and the chaotic.
Thinking about this, how might Jung's emphasis on the empirical nature of the collective unconscious be reconciled with those ongoing criticisms of his work as unscientific or mystical?
Well, I think he'd argue that empirical doesn't only mean quantifiable lab experiments. For Jung, it also meant consistent, observable phenomena in human experience: dreams, myths, neuroses, creative acts, historical patterns. His evidence is more qualitative and pattern-based, rather than strictly quantitative. But for him, it's still evidence of a psychological reality. He's looking for these enduring patterns that shape human behavior, which are no less real for being intangible.
That makes sense. Building on that, in what ways does modern society, despite all its rationalism, still engage with superstitions or collective trickster phenomena, maybe unconsciously?
Oh, definitely. Think about things like Friday the 13th being seen as unlucky, or people knocking on wood, or jinxing things by speaking too soon, even if people say they don't really believe it.
Right.
Or the way we find humor, sometimes uneasy humor, in absurd, disruptive figures in media or politics, even when they might be destructive. These could be seen as unconscious manifestations of the trickster, keeping us in touch with chaos or the unpredictable side of life that our rational minds try so hard to suppress. It acts as a kind of compensatory force.
That's fascinating. For a visual or creative prompt, maybe explore how a specific archetype, like the trickster, is depicted in various cultural forms, literature, film, folklore, and analyze how these depictions might serve that compensatory function for modern consciousness.
And if you're interested in more on how archetypes relate to religious concepts, Jung discusses this further in his works Aeon and Psychology and Religion. Outro. We've truly plunged into the depths of Jung's The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious today, haven't we? We've seen how the collective unconscious isn't just some abstract theoretical construct for him, but an empirical reality he believes shapes our very being, manifesting through these universal forms like the shadow, Animus, great mother, wise old man, hero, and that ultimate totality, the self.
Yeah, and we've learned how these archetypes don't just exist as like dusty old myths, but as dynamic forces. They appear in our dreams, they influence our behavior, they drive the lifelong process of individuation. They really help us understand everything from personal neuroses to grand cultural narrative, reminding us that we're connected to a wisdom maybe far older than ourselves.
It's a profound thought, isn't it? That even in our hyper-rational scientific age, the unknown world of the psyche continues to mirror our empirical world and shape our reality in ways we barely notice. The integration of these powerful autonomous forces isn't merely an academic exercise from Jung's perspective. It's a fundamental human task, as crucial today, perhaps, as it was in primitive times.
So, what stands out to you from today's deep dive? As you continue your own journey of learning, maybe consider this. If, as Jung suggests, the collective unconscious is always collaborating with us, even when we're unaware, what might it be trying to tell you right now? And what surprising insight might emerge from your own deep well? Join us next time for another deep dive as we explore more sources and uncover more hidden insights. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.